In the name of Almighty Allah, the most merciful. My dear audience, the series of sessions we've been conducting in order to discuss different salient features of corporate governance regulations 2019, which are in vogue in Pakistan at this point in time. And so this session actually will review these regulations at length. And in our previous sessions, we have been discussing different key areas. And so let's have a quick review.
Excuse me, sir.
Yes, please.
Assalamualaikum, sir.
Assalamu
Sir,
alaikum,
we cannot
sir.
hear you properly.
Okay, can you now hear me?
Assalam.
See if you can hear me now.
Yes, sir. Now we can.
Brilliant. Okay,
Yes, sir.
so let's start the session. And so I have just shared that in our previous sessions, we have been discussing different key aspects of corporate governance regulations meant for the listed companies. And in today's session, we will have a review of an overall discussion pertaining to these regulations. So let's begin with the session. And I'd like to invite Ms. Hira Nadeem to have a reading actually of the key points. And what will we do actually? One by one, we will discuss the key points in order to just review and revise, because this is going to be the part of our forthcoming examination. So in order to just review it at length, I'll be conducting this review session. Government of Pakistan has, in fact, and the Securities and Exchange Commission of Pakistan, which is a regulator working on behalf of the federal government, has notified these regulations on 25th September 2019. And the notification actually is self-explanatory. If we look at this notification, we will find that in exercise of the powers conferred under Section 156, read with Section 512 of Companies Act 2017, the same having been previously published in the Official Gazette by the notification number so, dated 23rd April 2019, as required under proviso to subsection 1 of said Section 512, the Securities and Exchange Commission is pleased to notify the following regulations, namely, so short title and commencement is given in Regulation 1. Let's have a quick reading of this. Let me invite Ms. Hira Nadeem for this reading. Ms. Hira, please.
Assalamu alaikum, sir. Sir, is it
Assalamu alaikum.
possible if I don't read today because I'm not well at all and my throat is completely blocked? Is it okay if I don't read it today?
No issue at all. Let me ask another participant. We have with us Miss Aisha Zafar. Miss Aisha, could you please share with us Regulation 1 and then, of course, sub-regulations pertaining to Regulation 1?
Assalamualaikum, sir. Sure.
Assalamu alaikum.
Regulation 1, short title and commencement. These regulations shall be called the Listed Companies Code of Corporate Governance Regulations 2019. Regulation 2, these regulations shall apply to the listed companies based on comply and explain approach, except the requirements for which it is explicitly stated as mandatory, and it shall be the responsibility of the Board of Directors to use this approach wisely and of investors to assess differing company approaches thoughtfully.
That's right.
Regulation 3.
Miss Aisha Zafar, and addressing to rest of the participants, you see the concepts we have already discussed, especially comply or explain approach. We, in fact, understand that the legislature has promulgated and introduced these regulations in order to achieve a certain, targets, or in order to achieve certain useful purposes. And this is why, if we look at sub-regulation 2 of regulation 1, this is self-explanatory. And if I reread the same, these regulations shall apply to the listed companies. So this is important to mention that private limited companies which are not listed with the PSX are not addressed in these regulations. And these regulations are based on comply or explain approach. And you see, compliance is for the provisions which are mandatory, and explanation is required for those regulations which are non-mandatory. So this is how these regulations are devised. These regulations shall come into force from the date of its publication. So once these are published in the Gazette notification, then these regulations will be considered as the regulations notified, regulations in fact applicable to the listed companies. Regulation 7, as Regulation 2, in fact, deals with the definitions, and I'd like to go through these definitions. Let me invite Mr. Raza Rahman to share definitions given in Regulation 2.
In these regulations, unless there is anything repugnant in the subject or context.
Right. So clause A deals with annexure. Annexure means annexure appended to these regulations. As you see that especially under sub-regulation 1 of regulation 36 of these regulations, we know that there is an annexure attached, which is the compliance statement. And it pertains 19 points. So every listed company is required to furnish that statement of compliance on quarterly basis. And that is the annexure which is appended with these regulations. Now, clause B actually and C are the two key clauses which are the subject matter of the very wise approach introduced by the Commission, that is comply or explain approach. In this, in fact, this is with the understanding that the companies will understand their responsibility towards the stakeholders, and they will comply with these regulations in letter and spirit, with letter and spirit, to ensure the adherence to these best practices. Let me invite Mr. Amin Qureshi to share clause B and C. Yes, Mr. Amin, please.
Comply or explain approach means discretion of a company with request for non-mandatory provisions of these regulations, either to comply or provide appropriate explanation as to any impediment in its compliance in the compliance report along with the financial statements.
And clause C.
Mandatory.
Yes.
Yeah, the clause C states mandatory in relation to these regulations means such provisions that are construed to be strictly complied with by the company, and non-compliance of such regulations lead to penal proceedings under Regulation 37.
Right. Now look at these underlying points, that as long as non-mandatory provisions are concerned, the companies are having the discretion. They have a choice to exercise whether to furnish an explanation for the non-mandatory provisions, and they are supposed to explain that these are the impediments or hurdles that we are unable to comply with non-mandatory provisions. And as we have studied in the annexure A, that even for non-compliance of these non-mandatory provisions, companies are required to furnish an explanation in respect to the non-mandatory provisions. Now, in regards to mandatory provisions, you see, there is no exemption, there is no concession. So companies are required to strictly comply. The word construed to be strictly compliant. So in terms of these regulations, this is in fact considered that the companies are strictly complying with the mandatory provisions. And we have studied that in case company has welcome back. Now, in our session, we are discussing the different provisions of corporate governance regulations, and Regulation 2 deals with the important definitions. So let's have a look on the mandatory definition, which is given in clause C of subregulation 1 of regulation 2, which reads as follows. Mandatory in relation to these regulations means such provisions that are construed to be strictly complied with by the company, and non-compliance of such regulation leads to penal proceedings under regulation 37. Now, these two keywords I have highlighted for you: construed to be strictly complied, meaning thereby that this is expected, this is taken for granted that every listed company will strictly comply with the mandatory provisions of these regulations. And you know that these are the 8 provisions starting from regulation 3 to onward, and these are mandatory. And in case a company has failed to comply with these mandatory regulations, there are penal proceedings, meaning thereby there can be penalty imposed on that company in case of non-compliance of mandatory provisions. Now, unless otherwise specified, words and expressions used by, not defined in these regulations, shall have the same meaning as assigned to them in Companies Act 2017 and Securities and Exchange Commission of Pakistan Act 1997. You see, as we know, and we just discussed in a while ago, that these regulations came into being under proviso to subsection 1 of section 512 of Securities and Exchange Commission, and basically by the Securities and Exchange Commission. And this, in fact, section 512 is the part and parcel of Companies Act 2017. So Companies Act 2017 and Regulations 2019, they are the part and parcel, and they are absolutely in coherence with each other. And in case if there is a definition already given in Companies Act 2017, that would be considered the definition meant for Regulations 2019. Now, here comes chapter 2, number of directorship and composition of the board. And as you know, that regulation 3 is a mandatory regulation. So this also covers your assignment on committees of the board. So this is why I'd like to go through it with the help of you participants in order to assimilate, understand fully the purview of these mandatory regulations. Let me invite Ms. Minail Amir to share Regulation 3 with the participants. I'm afraid Ms. Minail, we can't hear her. So let's have Ms. Aisha Zafar to share Regulation 3 with the participants, please.
Yes, sir. Regulation 3, number of directorship. Subject to the requirements of Section 155 of the Act, it is mandatory that no person shall be elected or nominated or hold office as a director of a listed company, including as an alternate director of more than 7 listed companies simultaneously, provided that the said limit on directorship shall be effective when the board shall be reconstituted not later than expiry of its current term.
That's right. So Regulation 3 basically that covers mainly the very point that or a person cannot actually serve as an alternate director of more than 7 listed companies simultaneously. So at one point in time, he can be associated as a director with at max 7 companies, not beyond that. Now, diversity in the board is the next point. Ms. Aisha Zafar, please continue.
Diversity in the board. The board shall comprise of members having appropriate mix of core competencies, diversity, requisite skills, knowledge, experience, and fulfills any other criteria as deemed relevant.
Right. I will skip Regulation 5 and take you to Regulation 6 actually. And Regulation 6, as I said earlier, that while discussing comply or explain approach, I am now addressing mainly to your assignment, which deals with the compliance. And I have told you that there are 8 mandatory provisions that it is construed that every company is in strict compliance of those mandatory provisions. So another mandatory provision after Regulation 3 is Regulation 6. Ms. Aisha Zafar, please continue sharing with the participants.
Regulation 6, Independent Director. Subregulation 1, it is mandatory that each listed company shall have at least 2 or 1/3 members of the board, whichever is higher, as independent directors. Explanation: for the purposes of this sub-regulation, a listed company shall exceed 2/3 if any fraction contained in such 1/3 number which is not rounded up as 1. For the purpose of electing independent director, the board shall be reconstituted. Not later than expiry of its current term.
Right. Thank you very much, Ms. Aisha Zafar. And now it comes to subregulation 2 and subregulation 3. So let me share it with you. It is mandatory. Please turn off your mic. There is a noise. It is mandatory that the independent director shall submit his consent to act as director along with direction to the company that please turn off the mic. It is mandatory that independent director shall submit his consent to act as director along with declaration to the company that he qualifies the criteria of independence notified under the act, and such declaration shall be submitted to chairman of the board at first meeting which is held after election of directors, as well as on an event of any change affecting the independence. As I said earlier, that Regulation 6 and now Regulation 7, these are the mandatory provision. So let's have a look at Regulation 7 now and see what it entails. It deals with female director. Let's have Ms. Tehreen to share with us Regulation 7, please.
Sir,
Ms. Hira, please.
sir, I had a question.
Please.
Sir, when discussing about the composition of the board, that how many directors there should be and all. So, sir, you said that this is the part regarding the committees of the board. But, sir, in the committees of the board question, won't we just talk about those? I think 4 committees that are. I mean, do we have to include this part in that too?
No, that is actually committees of the board will be discussed once we will come to that chapter. But actually, this deals with the comply and explain approach. And as I said earlier, that Regulation 3, 6, and now we are discussing Regulation 7 and onward, there are total 8 regulations which comes in the ambit of mandatory regulations. So we are discussing comply approach or compliance approach actually, and these provisions, let me repeat them once again. It is Regulation 3, 6, 7, 8, 27, 32, 33, 36. These are 8 regulations which are the part and parcel of mandatory regulations, and it is construed that the said company is in strict compliance of these regulations to avoid any penal consequences.
Thank you, sir.
You're most welcome. Female director, let me have Ms. Tahreem actually to read Regulation 7 for the participants.
Regulation 7. Female directors subject to Section 154 of the Act. It is mandatory that the board shall have at least one female director when it is reconstituted after the expiry of its current term.
That's right. So at least one female director is a part and parcel of the composition, and this is a mandatory provision. You cannot avoid the presence of a female director, and that is a part of composition and complexion of the board. Now, another mandatory regulation, executive director, is Regulation 8. Let me invite Mr. Umar Amjad to share this with the classmates. I'm afraid Mr. Umar can't hear us. Let's have Mr. Saad Fawad to do the reading. Mr. Saad, please.
Yes, sir. So the regulation 8 is about executive directors. So it is mandatory that executive directors, including the chief executive officer, shall not be more than one-third of the board. For the purpose of the compliance with the requirement of the above sub-regulation, the board shall be reconstituted not later than the expiry of its current term. Explanation 1 says that for the purpose of this regulation, a listed company shall explain the reasons in compliance report any fraction contained in such one-third company which is rounded up as 1. Explanation 2 describes executive director means a director who devotes the whole or substantially the whole of its time, whether paid or not, to the operations of the company.
Right. So executive director is covered in Regulation 8, and this is how the mandatory provisions are formed to ensure that the board of directors is comprising of the people who are actually part, who are required to be the part and parcel. Either it is the female director or the executive director, and these explanations actually are just given for the clarity. And furthermore, if there is any ambiguity, then the matter can go to the court of law, and court of law can further interpret these provisions. Here, let's have a short break, and we will be yes, Mr. Temur, I'd like you to read Regulation 27 for the participants. Ms. Benail Amir, can you do the reading, please?
Yes, sir.
Please.
Audit Committee. It is mandatory that the Audit Committee shall be constituted by the Board, keeping in view the following requirements. 1. The Board shall establish an Audit Committee of at least 3 members comprising of non-executive directors and at least 1 independent director. Chairman of the committee shall be an independent director who shall not be the chairman of the board. The board shall satisfy itself that at least 1 member of the audit committee shall be financially literate. Explanation. For the purposes of this clause, the expression financial literate means a person who A. is a member of a recognized body of professional accountants, or B. has a postgraduate degree in finance from a university or equivalent institution either in Pakistan or abroad, recognized by the Higher Education Commission of Pakistan, or C. has at least 10 years of experience as audit committee member, or D. at least 20 years of senior management experience in overseeing of financial audit related matters. The audit committee of a company shall appoint a secretary of the committee who shall either be the company secretary or head of internal audit.
Absolutely right. So, for this purpose, in fact, it's not only that one should have the adequate qualification, but the requisite experience is also needed. And this regulation, number 27, has made it categorically clear that the one who is aspiring to hold this position is required to be financially literate, and he must have at least postgraduate degree from a university in the field of finance, and not only this, but also that degree has to be recognized by Higher Education Commission. Then the second, in fact, clause, that is clause C, that deals with the length of experience, and it is being said that at least 10 years experience is required, and besides that, 20 years experience in the role of senior management, and especially to be able to see the financial audit aspect of the company. So this is in fact pretty self-explanatory, and now it has taken me to sub-regulation 2 of regulation 27. So Ms. Benail, please continue sharing with the participants.
It is mandatory that the meetings of the Audit Committee shall be held as per the following requirements. The Audit Committee of a company shall meet at least once every quarter of the financial year. These meetings shall be held prior to the approval of the interim results of the company by its board and after completion of external audit. A meeting of the Audit Committee shall also be held, if requested by the external auditors, head of internal audit, or by the chairman of Audit Committee. The head of internal audit and external auditors represented by engagement partner, or in his absence any other partner designated by the audit firm, shall attend meetings of the Audit Committee at which issues, if any, relating to the accounts and audits are discussed.
Absolutely right. So you see, the frequency of the meeting is also given, and we have seen that the compliance report, which is required to be submitted to the commission, the frequency of the meeting is also one of the point out of these 19 points, and resultantly, if especially for the audit committee, this has been made clarified that at least once every quarter of the financial year, the audit committee is required to meet. And this is not only limited to that. If a requisition is made that it is required that audit committee shall convene a meeting, that has to be convened. Now we have certain provisos to regulation 27. So let's have a look on these provisos. Ms. Benail, please continue.
Provided that Chief Executive Officer and the Chief Financial Officer shall not be members of the Audit Committee but should be available to attend its meetings at the invitation of the Chairman of Audit Committee. Provided further that at least once a year, the Audit Committee shall meet the external auditors without the Chief Financial Officer and the Head of Internal Audit being present.
There is a break in your voice, Ms. Benail. Let me, in the meantime, explain actually proviso 1 and 2. And in fact, this proviso is given, which states that the CEO and CFO of the company shall not be the member of audit committee. You see, this word shall not denote that this is compulsory, and this provision cannot be avoided. And so it is compulsorily required that for the audit committee, these two key personnel of the company should not become the members of the audit committee, and but should be available to attend the meetings at the invitation of the chairman of audit committee. You see, this proviso is inbuilt in this regulation 27, and the primary purpose is that in case if there are certain queries in the mind of the audit committee, then these two key personnel are required to be available. But on the other hand, they cannot become the members of the audit committee, and that is just to ensure that they are not the judge of their own cause, because their affairs are the subject matter of the audit committee and the audit committee's review. So this is why, in order to avoid that conflict of interest, this is made it clarified that they cannot become the members of the audit committee. The second proviso, Ms. Benail, there was disruption in your voice, so I'd like you to read the next proviso once again.
So the second one,
Please.
provided further that at least once a year, the audit committee shall meet these external auditors without the chief financial officer and the head of internal audit being present.
That's right. So primarily the audit committee, these two key personnels they should not influence the outcome or of the review by the audit committee of the fiscal position of the company. Their meeting, it is made it compulsory that at least once a year, I mean, and at least denote that this can be more than a year, or this can be twice a year or thrice a year as well. But at least once a year, the audit committee is required to convene the meeting with the external auditors, and without the presence of CFO and the head of internal audit, that is also the part of that meeting. Now, the next proviso, Ms. Benail, please continue sharing.
Provided also that at least once a year the audit committee shall meet the head of internal audit and other members of the internal audit function without the chief financial officer and the external auditors being present.
That's right. So audit committee is required to be in contact with the head of internal audit, and here the presence of CFO and CEO is also barred. Now we have subregulation 3, and let's have a look at subregulation 3. It is mandatory that the board of every company shall determine the terms of reference of the audit committee. So these TORs are required to be, in fact, are required to be determined in order to give a clear-cut indication to the audit committee that on what are their lines, or what is their reference of work actually, and what has to be their purview of working. So these TORs are supposed to be determined for the functioning of the audit committee. Now, subregulation 4 of regulation 27, that is quite a detailed one. So let's have a look. But if I will precisely share with you that in this subregulation, there is a list of in fact, assignments given. Ms. Benail, please have a look at the highlighted portion only to share with the participants. Ms. Benail, please.
It is mandatory that the board shall provide adequate resources and authority to enable the audit committee to carry out its responsibilities effectively, and the terms of reference of the audit committee shall be explicitly documented, which shall also include the following.
As I said earlier, that in order to make the working of the audit committee as per expectations and as per the given regulations, the TORs or terms of reference are enumerated underneath. And if you look at this list, actually, it's a very detailed list having at least 7 areas from A to G, which covers almost everything. But as it is said, that this list is not exhaustive, and of course this is just an indication that these areas must be taken into consideration, or these are the terms of reference for the audit committee. So let's conclude here, and before we have further discussion, I'll just have a small pause here. So here we are. Let me ask Ms. Benail to read subregulation 5. Ms. Armin Qureshi, can you do the reading, please? Ms. Aisha Zafar, I'd like you to do the reading, please.
Yes, sir. Regulation 5, it is mandatory that the Secretary of Audit Committee shall circulate minutes of meeting of the Audit Committee to all members, directors, head of internal audit, and where required to Chief Financial Officer prior to the next meeting of the board.
That's right. So circulation of minutes of the meeting, this is the duty of the secretary. And you see the primary purpose of this circulation is that members of the board, actually, they must be well aware that what is the agenda of the meeting, and especially the meetings which has held in the past, those minutes are also required to be kept for the future reference. So this subregulation 5 deals with that. Now the proviso to subregulation 5 is given here, provided that where this is not practicable, The chairman of the audit committee shall communicate a synopsis of the meetings to the board, and the minutes shall be circulated along with the minutes of the meeting of the board. So, of course, this synopsis is also the précis of the different aspects of the meeting which is being discussed. I'll skip Regulation 28 that deals with the committees of the board, and that is the second assignment we will discuss later. I'll just take you to Regulation 32, which is another mandatory provision, and non-compliance of Regulation 32 can also entail penal consequences. So the mandatory provisions we are discussing, have a look at Regulation 32, which is, as I said, one of the mandatory provision. Here we are, that deals with external audit. And let's have Ms. Aisha Zafar reading the same for the participants. Yes, Ms. Aisha.
Yes, sir. Terms of appointment of external auditor. Sub-regulation 1, it is mandatory that no company shall appoint an external auditor, a firm of auditor which has not been given a satisfactory rating under the Quality Control Review Program of the Institute of Chartered Accountants of Pakistan and registered with Audit Oversight Board of Pakistan under Section 31I of the Securities and Exchange Commission of Pakistan Act 1997.
Very right. So external auditors, they are also the one who are duly qualified. And for the firm of auditors, this is required that under quality control review program, they must have satisfactory rating, and their past performance is gauged and granted the rating which is at least satisfactory, enabling the company to deploy them for the sake of their external audit. And let's have a look at sub-regulation 2 of Regulation 32. Yes, Ms. Aisha, please continue.
It is mandatory that no company shall appoint an external auditor, a firm of auditor which or a partner of which is non-compliant with the International Federation of Accountants Guideline or Code of Ethics, as adopted by the Institute of Chartered Accountants of Pakistan.
Right. This is, in fact, pretty self-explanatory. And now let's have Mr. Taimur Idnan to share with us sub-regulation 3 of Regulation 32.
It is mandatory that the board of a company shall recommend appointment of external auditors for a year, and its remuneration as suggested by the Audit Committee, and such recommendations shall be included in the Director's report. And in case a recommendation for appointment of an auditor is other than the retiring auditor, the reasons for the same shall be included in the Director's report.
Right. So director's report is also discussed here for the external auditors, and the span of this appointment has to be a year period, and the remuneration is also needs to be decided for at least a year period for the external auditors. Mr. Taimur, please continue with sub-regulation 4.
It is mandatory that no company shall appoint its external auditors to provide services in addition to audit except in accordance with these regulations, and shall require the auditors to observe applicable International Federation of Accounts guidelines in this regard.
Right. Basically, the external auditors, their main function is to conduct audit of the financial statements of the company and other fiscal affairs. And so they cannot be assigned other services in addition to the job they are primarily, their services are catered for. Sub-regulation 5, Mr. Taimur Idnan, please.
It is mandatory that the company shall ensure that the auditors do not perform management functions or make management decisions, responsibility for which remains with the board and management of the company.
Absolutely right. So you see, this is precisely that A cannot be the judge of his own cause. The role of external auditor is primarily to conduct audit. So they cannot perform management functions or make management decisions. because management functions and management decisions are the purview of this audit mandate. So if they are performing the management functions and making decisions, ultimately they cannot judge their own cause. They cannot be the audit firm for what they themselves have done. So in order to avoid this conflict, this provision is made the part and parcel. Mr. Taimur, please continue. Ms. Tahreem Nadeem, can you do that, please?
Yes, sir. It is mandatory that no company shall appoint a person as an external auditor or a person involved in the audit of a company who is a close relative, spouse, parents, dependents, and non-dependent children of the chief executive officer, the chief financial officer, the head of internal audit, the company's secretary, or a director of the company.
Right. So this is again actually that being an external auditor, in fact, even their close relatives, they cannot become the part of this audit mechanism. And that is just to make the audit functions more transparent. It is mandatory that every company requires the external auditors to furnish a management letter to its board within 45 days of the date of audit report. And there is a proviso given, provided that any matter deemed significant for the external auditor shall be communicated in writing to the board prior to the approval of the audited accounts by the board. So of course, this communication is required to be in writing. A rotation of board is also a mandatory provision, and board, in fact, a rotation of auditors. And you see, external auditors, the period given for the rotation is 5 years. After each 5 years period, the former auditors are replaced with the new auditors, and we call those former auditors as retiring auditors. So we will move on to the last mandatory provision, that is provision number 36. So let's have a look at Regulation 36, which is the last mandatory requirement. That is compliance statement and auditor's review. In my previous session, I have shared at length compliance statement and auditor review in a separate video. And in that transmission, you can see that not only the compliance statement and auditor review, Regulation 36 is discussed, but we have also discussed at length in Annexure A, which is a 19-point document, which encompass all the aspects of the compliance statement. So you can, of course, watch that session in order to understand Regulation 36 and Annexure A, which is the compliance report, which is the compliance statement. So with these words, let's conclude this session. And we have discussed at length that out of these 39 regulations, which are embodied in 2019 regulations meant for corporate sector, meant for listed companies. So these regulations, the total number of regulations, as I said, are 39. Out of 39 regulations, there are 8 regulations which are mandatory, and remaining 31 are non-mandatory. So for these 8 regulations, the companies are required to furnish a compliance statement, and these regulations are construed to be strictly complied with, and there is no exemption, there is no concession. On the other hand, for remaining 31 regulations, companies can furnish an explanation and can explain with reasons that these are the impediments, that they are unable to comply with the non-mandatory provisions. This is how we conclude our topic for the assignment titled Comply or Explain Approach. And we have discussed the mandatory provisions. And this is how also an overall review of key regulations we hereby conclude. Thank you very much for your participation, and all the best.